Hello, this is Douglas Rumbaugh, and in this episode of the Linux Back to Basics series, I'm going to discuss an application that's standard, very conventional in Linux, although it doesn't get used a whole lot anymore, and that is groff. Now, groff is a very old school document formatting system. It stands for GNU Roff, and Roff is short for runoff, which is a very old, like original Unix type formatting system for making documents on the terminal. If you're familiar with LaTeX, we're in the same ballpark. LaTeX and groff are fairly similar, although they do things in very different ways. So this groff utility is useful because it's fairly simple and easy to use. Its syntax is fairly brief. It doesn't take a lot of typing to get your formatting across necessarily. And it's very small. The full groff environment's not very big. In fact, let me just go ahead and run a fake install of it quick. Groff. There, not counting dependencies, of course, the groff and all of its associated toys are less than 10 megabytes. Compare this to TextLive Core, which is a lot more than that. So it's a useful trick to know. This is also the system that is used for formatting Linux man pages. So if you ever want to write a man page, groff is what you're going to be doing or going to be using to do that. So groff itself, and there's actually a lot more to it than what I'm going to say here. Linked in the description below is a blog post that I wrote on my website that goes into a lot more detail about how this all links together and all the different little pieces that are interconnected to make this work. The groff program we're going to use smooths all of that over and just gives you one interface. Conventionally, this would involve a lot of small programs and pipelining. But we'll just stick with groff for simplicity here. So groff itself is pretty straightforward. It accepts on standard input the document you want to process, and it writes to standard output the formatted document. We'll get into the exact syntax of specifying formatting, but the general idea is you type the text you want to see. So if I want to see hello world, well, I can do that. I'll just say hello world like this, hit enter. And now to signify that I'm done typing text on standard input, I send the EOF marker, which on Linux is Control-D. And as you can see, we get a whack ton of stuff dumped onto standard output. Now what this is actually a PostScript program which will render a document with the contents I just typed. So if you're not familiar with PostScript, it's a programming language out of Adobe that's used to, much like groff is, to describe documents. But PostScript is what printers will use. I believe it's also the basis for the PDF file format. So if I want to actually save this thing, I can do that. I'll just do an output redirect. We'll call this output.ps for PostScript. Give it my same input here, and we now have our output.ps. Now, PostScript isn't a super common format for actually sharing documents. It is a programming language. It's not a document, but there are a number of things that will let you look at it. So let's just open this up in events, like so, and there you go. You can see this is our document. It, in fact, has hello world shoved up here at the top. PostScript is probably not the output you want to use though, so let's make this give us a PDF instead. Groff will actually output files in a variety of different formats. PostScript is just the default. So if you want to change the output format, you use the tac-t argument. So I'm going to say groff tac-t, and then you just directly write the format you want right after this. So for example, I could do HTML if I wanted HTML. In fact, let me just do that real quick just to show you how this works. There you go. it's now output a bunch of HTML code, which has my hello world text in the document. But for our purposes, we want a PDF. So I'll say tact PDF, output.pdf. There you go. And there you go. So we're generating a PDF now, just like so. As a matter of fact, let me do this. I'm going to leave this floating around in the background. So I'm going to redirect all output to dev null and run it as a background process. Okay, so now it shouldn't interfere with our terminal session at all. Cool. Obviously, you don't want to just be typing all of your stuff into standard input. So let's create a file that contains the code for this thing. There is no convention for raw groff input. So I'm going to use .tr, which is what the manual recommends as the extension. And when we get to macro packages, the convention is to use the macro package as the extension. And you'll see what I mean when we get there. But I'm going to say hello.tr. And we'll say hello world, like so. And so we actually have two different ways of doing this. I could do it the conventional way of catting it and then piping it into groff. But groff also will accept a file name as an argument. So I can say groff tact pdf hello.tr output redirect. Now let me shrink that a little bit. Output redirect to output.pdf. And we're good to go. One of the cool things about events as a PDF viewer is if you watch that closely, see it flicker there? Events will monitor the files that it has open, and if you update one, it will refresh it, which makes it very handy for this sort of thing using, say, groff or latex, because when you rebuild your document, the PDF viewer will automatically update to display the most recent updated version of the document, which is quite nice. Adobe Acrobat or Adobe PDF Reader will actually lock it, so if you do this, your thing will fail on Windows anyway, because it locks it for updating. But Events not only lets you update it, but will make sure it's always showing the updated version. I highly recommend that for things like this. Anyway, that gets us our basic document. So hooray, we've made a hello world document. Now, in terms of actually doing formatting, right? Let's actually do something useful with this thing. The raw runoff ROFF that groff is based on language for doing this is a very low-level formatting language that's designed to give you a lot of programmability and control over what your output looks like, which is a useful thing, but it is ridiculous overkill if all I want to do is make some bold and centered text, which is normally all that you want to do, right? Or maybe some bullet points or something like that. And so what comes with groff is a collection of what are called macro packages. And you can think of a macro as a lot like a function or a mini program that will handle formatting for you. So you can just say, I want to make that bold, and it will make it bold. And you don't have to worry about all the underlying formatting commands that go into making that happen. There are a bunch of macro packages. We're going to use one called ME for this video. And so we'll start by just including ME and showing what happens here. So the convention is you want to use the macro package as the extension for the file. So I'm going to go ahead and take my hello.tr and rename it to hello.me, just using the move command there. And now I want to run groff with a PDF output, and I specify that I'm using the ME macro package, hello.me, and output.pdf. There you go. So we have now just run our same hello world thing through the ME macro package. you can immediately see a difference in that the ME macro package is automatically enforcing a reasonable top margin. So that's handy. That's one less thing we have to worry about. Let's actually apply some formatting to this thing now. So I'm going to make hello come out in bold. I'm going to make world come out in italics. I'm going to make the comma and the exclamation mark just come out in normal font facing. It's going to be bold hello, then the comma, then italics world, then the exclamation mark, all on one line, just like it is here. So the way that we're going to do this is as follows. Groff is a line-based system. So each line of input constitutes something that Groff is going to process. Now, of those lines, there are actually two different types. The first is what's called a text line like that. And what we have here, hello world, is one of those. So this is just text. This is raw text that is going to be displayed. And as I'm sure you can imagine, when you're talking about an actual document that you're writing, the vast majority of your file is going to consist of text lines. However, there are also control lines, the word control there, which are going to specify the formatting. And so a control line is going to include either a macro or what's called a request, which is a low-level groff command. So requests are the actual groff code, and then macros are collections of requests that have been given a name to format your thing. And you indicate a control line with a leading period. So if there's a period at the beginning of the line, it's a control line. If there's not, it's a text line. Technically, you can also have single quotes for certain things, but that's nothing we're going to worry about for our purposes. All of our control lines are going to be period. So if I want to make the word hello bold, I want to use the bold macro. And there's no bonus points for guessing what that is. .b. Dot for control line, B for bold. And now these macros are going to accept arguments in much the same way that a command would accept an argument. And all you have to do is list the argument after it like this. So .b hello is going to take hello and make it bold. I do not want the comma to be bold, so I won't put that in my macro. I'm going to put it down on the next line. By default, a single line break in your groff input file like this is not actually going to map to a line break in the output document. We'll see how to make line breaks in our output document in a little bit longer. I want world to be italics, so I will use the italic macro, I. Surprise, surprise. And then I want the exclamation mark to be not. So there you go. This should give us bold hello, normal comma, italic world, normal exclamation mark, all in one line, in exactly the same position that we see right here. I can zoom this in a little bit. Let's give this a shot, see if it works. Fun fact, if you didn't know this already, if you're in the VI or Vim text editors, you can run a shell command from the EX command line by just leading it with an exclamation mark. So if I do :bang groff, and I want to do output PDF, me macro package, I'm doing hello.me, output.pdf. So I can just run that groff command from here. And as you can see, this automatically updates to match. And the cool thing is now if I go back into EX command mode, if I just hit the up arrow key, I can recall it, run it again. Very convenient. I highly recommend the VI or Vim text editor for this sort of thing for that reason. I understand that groff also integrates really nicely with Emacs if that's your thing. Anyway, you'll notice we have a slight problem, which is that we have a space here and a space here. So hello is bold and world is italics and the punctuation is not, but we do have extra spaces. And so how can we get around this problem? Well, as it turns out, the bold and italics macros account for this. So if I want the hello or the comma to be right beside the hello, what I can actually do is provide it as the second argument to my bold function or bold macro, and the same for the exclamation mark, just like that. So arguments are separated by spaces, just like they are in Bash. So I now have just two control lines, each one taking two arguments. And what happens is the first argument here will get bolded or italicized. The second argument is just going to get placed directly after the first one without any formatting applied. So check this out. There you go. The spaces have gone away, but we still don't have bold or italics on our hello and our world. Kind of neat. Let's center it. So the ME center macro is actually a two-parter. There's one macro that says we're going to start centering, and there's a second macro that says we're going to stop centering. There's also a lower level request that does the same thing. We'll use the macro because when you're using a macro package, you usually want to stick to that macro package and not dive lower. In a lot of cases, it'll break if you do. So you want to try and stick with the macros when you can. We'll use the macro package centering, which is this. So I'll type it first. There you go. So I think this one is fairly straightforward what it's doing. The C is, of course, for center. The open parenthesis means we're going to start, and the closed parenthesis means we're going to stop. So this macro is going to take all of the stuff in between and center it. And let me go ahead and zoom this out so we'll actually be able to see it. In fact, what's the best way of doing it now? There we go. And it's centered. Cool. So bold, italics, and centered. To be honest with you, with this, once we introduce the concept of a paragraph, we'll actually have most of what we need for probably 90% of non-technical writing that you'll ever do. You could, with just this, you can probably do most of your school papers just fine, right? So let's go ahead and start adding some paragraphs and whatnot as though we were going to do a paper. Actually, what we'll do is let's do a centered bold title followed by a centered not bold author name followed by the paper. So we'll start basically faking a paper. So I want, let's say my title is, this is my title. Okay. So before I do anything, what's your guess as to how this will work? Is this going to work the way that I think that it is, or is there going to be a problem? There's going to be a problem. So let's actually zoom this in a little bit. So as you can see, what it has done is it has taken this and made it bold. It has taken is, not bolded it, and put it directly beside the this, and that's it. Which is exactly what we should expect this thing to do based on what we just talked about, right? We take the first argument and we bold it. We take the second argument and we append it to the first, and the third and fourth arguments don't do anything. So the problem is that what we want to do is we want to bold multiple words when the bold macro is basically looking for arguments separated by spaces. And so this is not seeing this is not seeing bold, this is my title. This is seeing bold, and then the first argument is this, and the second it is, and the third is my, and the fourth is title. You'd have the same problem if you were trying to pass this as an argument into a program in Bash. So how would you get around this in Bash? Well, you would put it in quotation marks. That's going to tell Bash to ignore the quotes and treat it as one thing. How do you get around it in groff? You put it in quotation marks. That's going to tell groff to treat it as one thing. So if I take this and I put it in quotes, like so, now we get what we want. It's going to take this whole block of text and treat that as the first argument. And I can still provide a second argument. So if I just say like a hyphen or something as the second argument, you'll see the hyphen shows up not bolded directly adjacent to the title, as you would expect. Okay, now let's add the author. So one might think, well, I could just do this. Right, I'm gonna just throw the author there. However, if I run this, what we'll see is that it's actually taking the author and putting it on the same line as the title, which it's naturally doing because we haven't told groff that we want a line break there. Now, one thought as to how you might do this is, what if we put a blank line between the two? Like this. And that does do it, sort of. You'll see our centering is a little bit wonky, but we'll hit that in a minute. It does do it. However, this is not the way that you're supposed to do it. In fact, if you read the manual for groff, it explicitly says not to put blank lines in your files because the blank line actually has meaning, and so it can get a little bit wonky, especially if you're used to, as say a programmer, using blank lines to naturally space things out. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to use a macro. The ME macro set has macros for paragraphs, which are going to include line breaks. There's two of them. There's LP and there's PP. All the jokes have been made. I swear, no comments, please. So what LP is going to do is it's going to make a paragraph that doesn't have an indent. It's short for leading paragraph, right? Because conventionally, the first paragraph in a section is not indented because it's unnecessary. And then PP is going to give you an indented paragraph. So let's throw a paragraph break in here to space things out a little bit instead of this blank line. And we'll use LP because I don't want an indentation. Like this. And as you can see, we get a similar thing. Now the line break isn't as large. It's a slightly smaller amount of spacing because it's actually not a full line that separates it. It's a fraction of a line. Kind of like in Microsoft Word where the default after paragraph is like 8 point or whatever. It's the same idea here. It has a slight, this particular macro package uses a slight extra amount of space between paragraphs that we're seeing there. But that's that. Now, let's take a look at this centering problem. This actually has to do with the way that the center macro works. Right? We would expect for this is my title to be centered, and then for Douglas Rumbaugh to be also centered. But what we actually have here is this is my title is centered, and then Douglas Rumbaugh is aligned with this is my title. It's left aligned right here. What we would expect is for this to be shifted over a bit so that the middle of Douglas Rumbaugh is in the middle of the page, just like we have with the title. In order to do this, we actually have to use two separate centering directives, two separate centering macros. So I'm going to go ahead and actually take this LP and this Douglas Rumbaugh out of my title block. I'll go ahead, let's throw an LP. And now let's throw another centered block for the author, like this. And so if we do this, now we get what we expect, where both of these lines are individually centered. So that's something to bear in mind with the centering, is it's going to align everything like that. So if you don't want that, you're gonna have to do it this way. Now we're getting a little ugly already, and you can sort of start to see one of the disadvantages of groff and how it can be a little bit clunky. It's not super pretty. So let's at least space this out a little bit so that it's a tad more readable. Now, as I've already said, we can't just go ahead and start throwing blank lines in here because those blank lines have meaning. And we may or may not get changes in the output depending on where we put the blank line. I don't know if we'll actually, because we're using a paragraph macro, there we go. So if I put a blank line there, the output changes. Right, take the line out and we get that instead. However, this blank line doesn't affect anything, so it gets a little bit wonky. What we use instead in groff to space things out is basically an empty control line. So I'm going to use a period to designate that the line is a control line, but I'm not going to specify a command. So I can just do this, like that. You'll see it doesn't change the output. This is purely cosmetic, but it lets me actually space things out a little bit. So that's nice. Now that we have that, we can start actually adding text. Let's go ahead and add some spaces. So I'm going to put some blank lines just to put some spacing between the title and the actual text. And the way you do that is with the SP request. Now, note, SP is actually a request and not a macro. This is not part of our macro package. Depending on the macro package, you may or may not be able to use requests with it. When in doubt, you can always look at the manual page. So I'm going to go ahead and say man. I'm using the ME macro package, so groff_ME. This is the documentation for this macro package. And if we take a look inside of here, this is the operative bit here. So most requests are unsafe. However, the following requests might be used after the first paragraph. And they are a page break, break output line, insert spaces. So that's what we want. And also this is the one you use to set line spacing. We'll see that later, whether it's single spaced or double spaced. So we can use this as long as we've done a paragraph first. Now, technically it does say PP and I'm using LP, but they're both paragraphs. I think it's okay. I've never had a problem. If you do this and you do have a problem because of not using PP, please leave me a comment because I'd love to find out whether or not LP actually works. The thing with like unsafe macro or unsafe requests in the macro package and things like that is, you know, these are very big, complicated things. Something may actually work most of the time and just not work some of the time, right? So it says it's unsafe, not that you are not allowed to do it and not that it will instantaneously break things. But at some point it may cause a problem. So that's why they say that. You should stick to the manual when you can. I don't like the PP because that's going to force an indentation and I don't want any indentations going on here. So I'm assuming that LP will work just fine as well. Anyway, we can say .sp and let's put 3 spaces or three blank lines. And then we can begin our first leading paragraph. This is my first paragraph. It's a leading paragraph, so it doesn't need an indent. Okay, there you go. So we have the first paragraph is being written. Let's actually throw a section header on here as well. So we'll say .b and first section header. Again, I'm going to want to make sure that I put this in quotation marks, and then we'll add another LP there to space it out a little bit. And here you can see, again, we have that slight amount of extra space. It's not a full, or how should I word this? It's not 2 line breaks, but it's also not 1 line break. It's somewhere in between. And so we can continue to add text here. Blah, blah, blah. More text, and another sentence, and another sentence, and on the sentence goes. I don't know. As you can tell, I'm real creative. So you can see that this is automatically going to handle wrapping the text and all of that stuff when we get to the edge. One thing to bear in mind, and this is, again, this is a cosmetic thing over here, it's not going to affect the program, is that the manual actually recommends that you put you start each sentence on a new line in the file. So what I like to do is I like to just space out each sentence like this. I'm going to add a blank control line followed by the sentence, followed by blank control line, followed by sentence, blank control line, followed by sentence, blank control line, followed by sentence. Something like that. And of course, if you want, you can go ahead and just wrap this stuff so it looks pretty. There we go. Sorry, that was a Vim fail right there. There we go. So you can put each sentence on its own line. Again, this is not going to actually affect the output. It looks exactly the same, but it does help pretty things up a little bit, make it a little bit easier to write and edit. And then when it's time for a new paragraph, because this is going to be the second paragraph, we want an indentation. So I'll use the pp macro for just a normal paragraph. There you go. Simple as that. And of course, you can go ahead and throw italics and bold text into your paragraphs. So if I want to, like, let's throw another sentence in here. There you go. You can bold a specific word by just doing that. The perhaps annoying thing is that your control lines have to start at the beginning of a line, which means that if I want to bold a word in the middle of a sentence, I have to, it's kind of clunky breaking the sentence apart like this. That's just what you got to do. You can actually do another cool thing with paragraphs, which is rather than bolding based on an argument, bold this word or these words, you can actually use the bold and italics macro as a toggle. So watch this. If I just say .b, add some text here, that whole sentence is now bolded. And if I add another sentence, now, I would hardly call this writing gold, but it is bold. It also bolds that. So you can toggle bold on like this, and it's going to run until you hit the end of the paragraph. So if I call PP again, like this, you'll see paragraph 3 is not bold. And of course, this works just as well for italics as well. And italics and bold will turn each other, or you can toggle italics and bold like that. And as you can see, excuse me, when I flip the bold toggle, that turns the italics toggle off. So that's just something to play around with and be aware of as well. Now, these basic macros, the bold, the italics, the paragraph, the centering, and the extra spacing request here, are probably enough to handle 90% of your non-technical writing. There's a few other things you might want, like bulleted lists and things like that. But this is enough for most, say, your average college paper, right? There's not a whole hell of a lot to it, which is one of the things that's so wonderful about this. And obviously, the macro package supports a lot more options. So if we take a look at groff ME, below this, we get the macro reference section, which includes a list of all of the macros that are in this package. So here's our begin centered block. You can do footnotes and lists and quotes, all kinds of cool and useful things. Embed equations and pictures. which is going to require the use of some preprocessors. We'll talk about that in a different video. You can set headers and footers, which we'll do. So there's a lot of cool, useful things here. Also access page numbers for numbering pages and things like that. I'd encourage you to read through the man pages for these different macro packages to just see what's there. There's a list of the macro packages in the linked blog post. You can also find them in the groff man page here. Preprocessors, macro packages, here we go. So here's a listing of the ones that come standard. There are also other macro packages that you can install, such as mom is a popular one, MOM, which doesn't come standard, but you can get. But these are the ones that come standard. So one for basically HTML-like stuff, a variety of different memos and scientific document things. And of course, these are for man pages. This is the system that you use for making man pages after all. So there are actually 3 distinct macro packages for doing man pages, depending on which kind of man page you want to do. It's fun. And that is where I will leave this video because we are getting quite long. Groff is quite useful, and it's a core utility that I think, well, obviously it's a core utility because it's used to render man pages, but beyond that, you can use it for all kinds of document processing right from the command line without even needing a word processor or anything like that. And I'm inclined to like it a little bit more than Markdown because, well, they're 2 different things, right? Markdown is a markup language. This is a document processing language. So they're kind of similar, but a document processing language gives you a lot more control, or at least gives you the option to have a lot more control over what the output looks like than something like Markdown, right? In Markdown, you just specify that's going to be bold, that's italics, this is going to be in a table and that sort of thing. And then the actual export process is what controls how that all looks like. In here, you can embed, or you can control what it looks like just embedded in the document. So it's a little bit different. Like I said, this is a lot more similar to something like LaTeX than it is Markdown. But I hope that you found this video useful. In the next couple of videos in this series, we're going to be exploring Groff and some of its additional features a little bit more. I hope that you appreciate this. It's perhaps it's a slight stretch for back to basics, but this is a useful feature of the command line that you can use, so I think that it's worth doing. And of course, we'll do more string processing stuff as well, things like sed and awk and those other tools that are also useful for manipulating text. I hope that you found this useful, and I will see you in the next video.